Clarence and Tammera had always been seen as the heart of their church. For more than 15 years, they stood side by side, leading services, organizing charity events, and visiting the sick. They were the couple everyone pointed to as an example of a godly marriage, the kind of love story people believed only came from prayer and deep faith. Their smiles in public were warm, their hands always joined in prayer, and their voices united when they spoke about the goodness of God. So when whispers began to spread that something was wrong, no one wanted to believe it. And when the news finally came that Clarence and Tammera were ending their marriage, the entire congregation felt as if the ground beneath them had shifted. This wasn't just another divorce. This was the breaking apart of a couple who had built a ministry together, a couple whose love story had inspired countless people. Now, for the first time, both were ready to speak their truth, and the reality was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Clarence and Tammera's journey began in the most unexpected way. It was during a youth revival meeting in a small, crowded church hall, where the air was filled with music, laughter, and the sound of people worshiping. Clarence had been invited as a guest speaker, known for his ability to inspire young people with his words. Tammera, on the other hand, was there as a volunteer, helping to organize the event and making sure everything ran smoothly. Their first meeting wasn't planned. Clarence had accidentally walked into the wrong room, and Tammera, holding a box of hymn books, nearly bumped into him. They both laughed, and in that brief moment, there was a connection neither of them could explain. Over the next few months, they sought each other more often at different church gatherings and conferences. Clarence admired Tammera's dedication to serving others, her soft-spoken kindness, and the way she always noticed the needs of those around her. Tammera was drawn to Clarence's confidence, his passion for ministry, and the way he made everyone feel valued. They began talking after events, sharing their dreams about helping their community, and before long, those conversations turned into late-night prayers over the phone. When Clarence proposed, it wasn't in a fancy restaurant or under bright lights. It was in the quiet corner of the church, after everyone had gone home, with just the two of them kneeling in prayer. Their wedding soon followed, celebrated not just by family and friends, but by an entire congregation that believed this union was truly blessed. Together, they became an unshakable team, working side by side to build a ministry that touched hundreds of lives. To the outside world, their marriage seemed like the perfect picture of love and faith. But behind that picture, life was slowly preparing challenges that neither of them saw coming. At first, Clarence and Tammera's life together was filled with joy and purpose. But as the years went by, small cracks began to appear, cracks that most people never saw. Their ministry had grown quickly, attracting more members and requiring more time, more effort, and more responsibility. Clarence often found himself spending long hours at the church office, preparing sermons, meeting with the board, and handling financial matters. Tammera, meanwhile, was managing outreach programs, counseling women in the community, and organizing events that sometimes ran late into the night. What had once been their shared dream was now pulling them in different directions. At home, conversations became shorter. Dinner together was rare, replaced by quick meals eaten separately between appointments. They began to disagree over ministry decisions. Clarence felt certain projects were too expensive, while Tammera believed they were necessary to meet people's needs. Even small matters, like how to divide responsibilities, sometimes turned into arguments. Friends and church members noticed subtle changes. Clarence no longer smiled as much during services, and Tammera often seemed lost in thought during worship. Privately, both of them began to feel misunderstood. Clarence felt the weight of leadership pressing heavily on his shoulders, and believed Tammera didn't fully see the pressure he was under. Tammera, on the other hand, felt her efforts were overlooked, her voice growing quieter in decisions that once involved both of them equally. They told themselves it was just a busy season and that things would get better, but the truth was, the distance between them was slowly growing, and neither knew how to bridge it. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening during a church board meeting. What started as a simple discussion about the upcoming annual conference quickly escalated into something far more personal. Tammera had proposed hosting a large outreach event aimed at helping struggling families in the city, but Clarence immediately raised concerns. The room fell into uncomfortable silence as the disagreement turned into a heated exchange. Board members shifted uneasily in their seats, unsure whether to intervene. Clarence, frustrated, said words he would later regret, questioning whether Tammera understood the pressures of keeping the ministry afloat. Tammera's face changed instantly, her eyes welling up as she quietly gathered her notes and left the meeting without another word. That night, they barely spoke at home. Days turned into weeks, and the tension that had been simmering for years now felt like a wall between them. Counseling sessions were scheduled, prayers were made, but every attempt to reconnect seemed to circle back to the same unresolved issues. Clarence felt he was fighting to hold the ministry together while losing his marriage in the process. Tammera felt she was losing her place in both the marriage and the ministry they had built side by side. The love that once brought them together now felt overshadowed by resentment and unspoken pain. It was a Sunday morning like any other, the church filled with the familiar sound of choir music and the rustle of hymn books. The congregation had no idea that the service they were about to witness would be unlike any other in the church's history. Clarence stepped onto the pulpit first, his Bible in hand, but his voice carried a heaviness that immediately caught everyone's attention. Tammera stood a few steps behind him, her eyes lowered, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. After the opening prayer, Clarence cleared his throat, glancing briefly at Tammera before looking out over the congregation. His words were careful, almost trembling. "Church family," he began, "Tammera and I have prayed long and hard about what I'm about to share with you today. This is not an easy thing to say, but we believe it's time to be honest." A murmur moved through the crowd as he continued, explaining that after many months of trying to reconcile, they had made the difficult decision to end their marriage. Some gasps could be heard, followed by complete silence. Tammera then stepped forward, her voice soft but steady, thanking the congregation for their love and support over the years. She emphasized that this was not a decision made out of anger, but one reached after deep reflection and prayer. Still, the pain in her tone was unmistakable. By the end of the announcement, some members were openly crying. Others sat frozen, unsure how to react. Within hours, social media was buzzing with speculation. Posts ranged from shock and sadness to outright judgment. People began taking sides, some defending Clarence, others supporting Tammera, while a few called for privacy and compassion. What had once been the church's most admired couple had now become the center of a storm no one could have predicted. In the days following the announcement, Clarence decided it was time to share his side of the story. Sitting down for an interview with a local Christian magazine, he spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. He explained that the decision to divorce had not come suddenly. It was the result of years of feeling overlooked and worn down. Clarence described how, over time, their shared vision for ministry had started to drift apart. He claimed that Tammera's focus had shifted heavily toward her own ministry projects, which often operated separately from the church. While he admired her passion, he admitted that it left him feeling as though he was carrying the heavier load alone. Clarence spoke about the long nights spent preparing sermons, handling financial struggles, and dealing with church conflicts, often without Tammera's input. "I wasn't asking for her to give up her calling," he said, "but I needed us to be partners again, not just in name, but in action." He confessed that the loneliness he felt within his own marriage was sometimes harder to bear than the pressures of leading the congregation. He also addressed the board meeting incident that had become a turning point. Clarence admitted his words that night had been harsh, but insisted they came from a place of frustration and exhaustion. "I made mistakes," he acknowledged, but I truly believed I was fighting to keep both the ministry and our marriage alive. For Clarence, the divorce was not about winning or losing. It was about accepting that two people, even with faith and love, could sometimes grow in different directions. But even as he spoke his truth, he knew Tammera's story would be different, and that hers would bring its own weight to the conversation. When it was Tammera's turn to speak, she chose not to do it through an interview or public forum. Instead, she wrote a heartfelt open letter that she shared on the church's community page. In it, her words were tender but honest, carrying both love for the years she had shared with Clarence and sorrow for the way things had unfolded. Tammera began by expressing gratitude for the congregation, thanking them for standing by her through the most difficult season of her life. Then she gently began to explain her truth. She shared how, in her view, Clarence had become increasingly controlling over the ministry's direction, often dismissing her ideas or reducing her role in decisions that had once been made together. She spoke of moments when her voice felt silenced and her contributions unseen, not just in ministry but within their marriage. She also addressed the perception that she had abandoned their shared vision for her own projects. Tammera clarified that her separate initiatives were never meant to compete with the church, but to expand its reach to people who might never step inside its walls. "I wasn't walking away from our calling," she wrote, "I was trying to carry it further." In her letter, Tammera didn't shy away from admitting that the emotional distance between them had been growing for years. She confessed there were nights when they would sit in the same room and feel like strangers. "We prayed together less, we laughed together less, and eventually we dreamed together less," she said. Her closing words were filled with grace. "I will always honor Clarence for the years we shared and the work we built. But sometimes love changes shape, and the bravest thing we can do is let go with kindness." The days after Clarence and Tammera's separate statements felt like a storm passing through the church, not one of wind and rain, but of whispers, tension, and divided loyalties. For years, they had been the anchor couple, the example others looked to for guidance on marriage, ministry, and faith. Now their split left the congregation unsettled, unsure of what this meant for the church's future. Some members openly supported Clarence, believing he had carried the heavier burden of leadership and had been patient for far too long. Others sided with Tammera, convinced that her voice had been ignored and her calling undervalued. There were those who tried to stay neutral, but even they could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Worship services felt different, lighter for some, heavier for others. Attendance began to dip, and regular donors started holding back their contributions, quietly waiting to see what direction the ministry would take. The leadership team found themselves in a constant struggle to keep unity. They organized prayer meetings, hosted reconciliation talks, and preached sermons about forgiveness and humility, but the undercurrent of gossip was hard to silence. Social media became a battleground of opinions, with long posts, cryptic quotes, and shared videos fueling the fire. Even outside the church walls, the story had spread to other congregations in the area. Some pastors expressed sadness and offered prayers, while others used it as a cautionary tale during their sermons. It was clear that Clarence and Tammera's separation had not only changed their personal lives, but had left a deep mark on the community they had built together. In the months that followed, Clarence and Tammera quietly stepped away from the public eye. The decision was not made out of bitterness, but out of a shared understanding that both needed space to heal. Clarence remained in the church for a while, focusing on rebuilding the congregation's trust and stabilizing the ministry. Tammera chose a different path, pouring her energy into smaller community programs and mentoring young women who were struggling to find their place in faith and life. Though they no longer worked side by side, their love for serving others had not disappeared. It had simply taken on different forms. On rare occasions, they would still cross paths at citywide charity events. Their conversations were polite, sometimes even warm, but always carried the unspoken knowledge of the life they once shared. For the congregation, the shock of the divorce slowly gave way to reflection. Many began to see their story not as a failure, but as a reminder that even the most admired leaders are human. Their journey showed that faith does not guarantee a life without struggle, and that sometimes parting ways is the only path toward peace. In one of his sermons months later, Clarence spoke without naming Tammera, but the meaning was clear. Sometimes God allows things to break, not to destroy us, but to rebuild us into something new. Likewise, in a closing statement at one of her outreach events, Tammera said, "You can love someone deeply and still release them, trusting that God's plan for both of you is still good." And so, while the marriage that once inspired a congregation had ended, the lessons it left behind continued to guide those who had witnessed their journey. Lessons of grace, growth, and the courage to move forward, even when the road ahead feels uncertain.